Thanks, Sister Moreline. I'm sure a lot of you have seen by now the photographs up in the Lyceum Gallery of the young Syrian ballerinas. I took those pictures almost a year ago, a year into the ongoing civil war in Syria. And one of the things I hope these pictures would do is to show a different side of war and revolution. When we see pictures of Syria these days, we tend to see violence. They look like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the Congo, Somalia, any country where there is a war. They all tend to be pretty similar. They're usually men with weapons, on tanks, maybe in military uniform, maybe fighting, tired, dirty, tough. And I was really struck when the Arab Spring began. I was living in Syria, and I was struck by the extent to which I would see pictures from Libya, and they looked just like pictures from Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Lebanon, or Egypt. It felt like you could just use the same photographs again and again and just change the caption, and nobody would know the difference. I couldn't actually learn anything about Libya, or Egypt, or other Arab Spring countries by looking at these images. There was nothing specific, no real humanity, personality, individuality, no real life to them. It was unclear to me what the point was. And the same thing happens in other areas of photojournalism too. We see pictures of poverty, especially third world poverty, and they often look nearly identical. If you look at pictures of Haiti, the Congo, South Africa, they seem interchangeable. They're close-up portraits of poor, black, usually children, with bright-colored dresses that are torn and dirty, big eyes and serious faces. People's lives seem to be defined simply by being poor. There's nothing else to who they are. How many people here have been to a third world country? South America, Latin America, okay, right. And in your experience, do the people you meet there, the lives you saw, seem to be defined just by being poor? When I graduated from Derryfield, I took a year off before college to not be in school for a while, and the first thing I did was went to Ghana, and I lived in a tiny rural village teaching English. And the people there were very poor, unsurprisingly. Some lived in mud huts, some lived in tiny concrete houses, no one had running water, no real electricity. But they didn't just sit around being poor or suffering. They had real lives. They had friends, enemies, rivalries, least favorite sisters, annoying uncles, and teachers. They had fun, laughs, sadness too, but they had complete lives. They were real people. And that's something I really see in photographs from Ghana or elsewhere in the third world, and certainly in photographs of countries at war. And partly the problem is the structure of photojournalism. It's a pretty glamorous world, or at least our image of it is. We see these rugged, handsome, young, usually male photographers jetting all over the world. And they're brave, they're adventurous, it's all very sexy. And we really idealize these cowboy photographers. But the problem is that most of them have no real relationship with the countries they're reporting on. They might show up in Somalia for a week, stay at expensive hotels with other Americans, do a couple of interviews with a translator because they don't speak the language. And it's not surprising that they come back with a bunch of cliches. And they're really dramatic, beautiful, visual cliches, but there's not a lot of substance there. And then the next week they move on to Uganda, then El Salvador, then Haiti, then Pakistan. When the revolution began in Syria, I had already been living there for almost 4 years. And living in a small, normal, middle-class town, I was able to see a very different side of war that most foreigners never do get to see. And had I sought it out, I wouldn't have seen it either. It was chance that I was there. I'd worked as a photographer in Iraq before a few times, starting in 2007. So I'd seen this very masculine public face of war. Soldiers, weapons, house raids, prisons, that kind of thing. But I didn't really know much about Iraq. I spoke Arabic, and that gave me the ability to dig a little deeper than the most superficial level, but even language isn't enough. On my second trip to Iraq, I was embedded with the US military, which meant I stayed with the American soldiers on their bases and went around and took pictures of whatever they were doing. And I was staying on a base in Mahmoudiya, in the part of Iraq that used to be called the Triangle of Death, for there was so much violence there. And the soldiers were going out on these house raids in the middle of the night, looking for certain fighters, these insurgents that were wanted for various crimes. And so they would show up at apartment buildings in normal civilian neighborhoods, in the dark, the middle of the night, at least 10 soldiers at a time, and they would bang on the doors and come into the houses to search them. And I felt really uncomfortable being part of that. First of all, I had no idea what I was doing. I'd been living in Syria studying Arabic, working at this insane asylum, and a friend of mine, a journalist who worked a lot in Iraq, was going back and he needed a photographer. I'd taken a photography class at Derryfield, and I guess I'd mentioned it to him, so he asked if I wanted to come along. I said yes. I didn't even have a camera at that point. I borrowed one. And it was a lot fancier than anything I'd used before. And so I remember that this first night of house raids in Iraq, I accidentally knocked the settings onto 15-second delay. The kind you use, when you like set up with all your family or friends, and you set the camera across the room and you pose there and wait for it to blink and take a picture. And so we're going around this house raid, and it's very dramatic, chaotic, a little scary. This is all happening in the dark. And I'd lift the camera, take a picture, press the shutter, lower the camera, hang on my shoulder. 15 seconds later, would take a picture of the floor. And I did that all night. But even beyond my camera struggles, I was really never sure what to do on the house raids. I wasn't a soldier. Why should I barge into someone's house in the middle of the night? Whether or not we even think soldiers have a right is a whole other question, but I certainly had no claim to a legitimate purpose for being there. And people were frightened. They were angry, as you might be if someone burst into your house in the middle of the night. Also, in the Middle East, people don't wear shoes inside their homes, and it's really rude to do so. And I felt this kind of irrational need to take off my shoes before going into these houses out of habit, but it's not really reasonable either, as it is chaotic, and the soldiers were pretty nervous. They would never know if when they knock on one of these doors, someone would be waiting behind it with a machine gun. And I really didn't want the soldiers to feel like I was a burden to them if I'm sitting there untying my shoelaces and they have to stand guard so nothing happens to me. So instead I'd say to these families as we'd come into their houses, I'd say in Arabic, I'm a photojournalist, I'm not with the army, I'm here to document this war, is it okay that I come in? And I was surprised, but they'd often be very welcoming and very polite about it all. They thought that if a photographer was present, the soldiers would be less likely to trash their houses or beat them up. And that may have been true. At one point when I was in Mosul later on a house raid, one soldier started getting a little carried away, a little physical with the man in the house, just sort of pushing him a little. And the commander said to him, "You have to stop, there are reporters here." So I felt like I was doing something ethical in Iraq, even if not really for the content of my photos, which were pretty mediocre even when they weren't up the carpet, but by being present, by being a witness. But my experience in Iraq was overall pretty superficial. I like to think I learned something about specific issues or people or places, but I really never saw beyond the guns, the fighting, to what everyday life looked like. And I never knew Iraq before the war, so I had no sense of how Iraqis' lives had changed, how much they had lost, what made their lives meaningful. But it was different for me in Syria. I had been there, and the war crept up on us, at least in Sakhnaya, my little town, slowly. It began with peaceful demonstrations in the street in cities halfway across the country. Even when the movement for freedom and democracy became a self-declared revolution, and even when the government settled into a routine policy of violent repression, it was still far away from Sakhnaya. It came closer over the course of the first year, and closer still the second year, but it still hasn't arrived to Sakhnaya, not at least in terms of tanks in the streets and shelling and bombing. We did feel the revolution happening, but in more subtle, material, everyday ways. It started with the crazily fluctuating currency. The government exchange rate held steady, a Syrian lira, about 50 Syrian lira are worth $1. And that didn't change for months and months, but on the black market, it reached the point where $1 was worth 100 Syrian lira. And suddenly, the Syrians who were otherwise untouched by violence found that their life savings were worth half of what they had been. Buying groceries for dinner, buying a cup of coffee cost twice what it used to. And the currency fluctuations were followed soon after by shortages. In the beginning, it was very specific food items that we couldn't get, whatever was normally produced in the places where the fighting was. Sometimes you couldn't get tomatoes, sometimes it was oranges, but it was always isolated items and never really a big deal. But then as the revolution spread throughout the country, food in general became harder to get. Combined with devalued currency, you'd pay a small fortune to get a handful of rubbery, floppy, old cucumbers. Heating oil wasn't hard to get, and cooking gas. So when winter came, houses were pretty cold. It was at one point 40 degrees in my living room. And I was lucky, because at least I had a living room. A lot of Syrians had been displaced at this point from their homes by the fighting. They were living in makeshift structures of tin and wood and whatever else they could find. Electricity started to come more sporadically. For a while, it'd be 4 hours on, 4 hours off, though later power cuts would be 8 or 12 hours. It was a really cold, dark winter last year when I was there, and I'm sure it's the same again this year. Worse in a lot of ways, because a lot of people have gone almost 2 years now without even working, living as internal refugees, and they can barely afford bread at this point. For me, the experience of war in Syria has been the opposite of my experience in Iraq. There's some fighting in my neighborhood now, shooting at night, occasionally in the day, but mostly it's still not violent there. And I haven't gone out in search of violence elsewhere. When I would take the bus to Damascus, which is only a few miles away, but now with the traffic and the checkpoints, it's almost 2 or 3 hours. I'd drive through a lot of the neighborhoods and towns that are centers of fighting, and you can see members of security services, basically the secret police, lined up along the highways with guns. You can see tanks there, cars and buses completely burnt out, houses demolished, stacks of tires on fire. And it's strange because I would pass through them to central Damascus, which is still largely safe and calm, and people go about their daily business, shopping, going to school. And then I'd come back, pass through those towns again, and end up in safe, normal Sahnaya. And I never went out to Dera or Homs or Aleppo where the real fighting is taking place, because I don't really want to get shot or anything, and I had no good reason to go there. I wouldn't have made it anyways, I would have been turned around at the first checkpoint, but I felt like I had nothing to offer a city like Homs. What could I do even if I made it there? Take some pictures of men with guns or wounded civilians covered in blood? The kind of pictures I saw from Libya that didn't really show anything about who these people were and what their lives were like? It wasn't a situation like in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, where photographs would come back from war and the public would be exposed to atrocities they didn't know existed. And they did affect public opinion. But in Syria, we know terrible things are happening, and we've seen pictures already. Syrians themselves take pictures and video on their cell phones and post them online. I have nothing more to offer to them. But in Sahnaya, I thought I could do something different, and I could certainly learn something. And I did every day. I saw people trying to keep their lives together, trying to make rational decisions in a situation that was anything but rational. And it's easy now that Syria has descended into a pretty awful and comprehensive civil war to feel like that was always going to be its trajectory, but in the beginning, nobody knew. We weren't sure if there were going to be a few peaceful protests and the government would just make some reforms and everyone would go back to normal life. We weren't sure if the government's violent crackdown would actually work and finish off the movement. And people had to make their decisions about their lives based on almost no information. And being there, seeing people try to continue to live meaningful lives, which often meant simply ignoring or denying the revolution, which does feel really strange. Helicopters and jets flying overhead, and if you ask someone, what was that? They'll say, what? What was what? Like it hadn't even happened. But what were they supposed to do? For me, the lesson was about opening my eyes to the world around me. I think that we're often drawn to run off in search of the exotic. I fled to Ghana, Spain, Syria, Iraq. I think culturally we really value and legitimize that. But often the most interesting places and people and phenomena are close by. They're the things we're so used to, we don't see them anymore. I think that's where we can learn the most about our world and people and the crazy things we do, not just by seeking out wars and famines and these really alluring, journalistically at least, crisis situations, but by taking photographs of our neighbors, figuring out what makes their lives meaningful, trying to understand our own culture. For me, it was a slow and often clumsy process of trying to actually see and hear what was happening around me. And one of the things I learned in Syria was that while war and violence do often bring out the worst in human nature, our basest, cruelest inclinations, the kinds of things we see relentlessly in the media, it often produces great heroism. At first, when the war began in Syria, I felt pretty bleak about humanity. Without getting too graphic, I couldn't really imagine living in a world where people did the kinds of horrible, violent things that they were doing in Syria. I'd hear stories about torture from people I knew, and I thought, I don't want to be a person if this is what being a person can mean. But I realized that although the violent actions have perhaps a greater consequences than the generous and peaceful ones, and they're certainly more public, many people in Syria were demonstrating the kind of bravery, daring, generosity that I could never have imagined or aspired to myself. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been displaced from their homes and from the fighting. And other Syrians, also poor, also struggling to afford even bread or water, take them into their homes. Young activists, teenagers, risk their lives to smuggle medicines to besieged cities where people are dying from very treatable wounds and illnesses because they have nothing. And people give up everything, all their savings, their homes, their families, and they risk not just being killed, but being arrested and tortured for these ideas that they've never even experienced, they can only have dreamt about: freedom, democracy, human rights. One of the young revolutionaries, actually someone from my neighborhood, who started organizing peaceful protests right from the beginning, and he kept on his work up until a few months ago when he was arrested. He's still one of the most relentlessly cheerful, happy, optimistic people I know. No matter how many people are killed every day or whatever setbacks the revolution suffers, he truly believes he is changing his world for the better. And it's not that his happiness is somehow false, that it's easier for him because he's not really taking risks, he's not fighting, he isn't sacrificing. Because he is, he's taking huge risks. And the last time anyone saw him, he was in prison being tortured. But he's still willing to risk anything and everything for his principles. How many of us can say that? How many of us even know someone like that? I can't think of anything I truly believe in enough that I would die for it, that I would be tortured for it, that I would sacrifice my family for it. We talk about our ideals all the time in this country: freedom, liberty, democracy, and they actually sound a lot like the same things Syrians are talking about now. But we don't sacrifice them for them the same way. How many of the real environmentalists in this room would actually be willing to give up their cars or heating their houses because that's what it would take to save the environment? How many of the human rights activists in this room would be willing to spend the rest of their lives in prison in awful conditions if it meant 100 other political prisoners could go free? That's nothing compared to what Syrians suffer every day. The same friend, the optimist, told me that I, as an American, could never understand what freedom really feels like because I was born into it. So I could never understand its absence, what it feels like to be free for the first time in your life. He said that he felt that, standing in a crowd of peaceful demonstrators, for the first time demanding his rights, demanding to have a say in his own life, holding his government responsible. And so despite the horrors and the fears and the truly relentless depression that comes from seeing Syria, a country that I love and thought that might be home, slip into the same mistakes we see in Iraq and Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East: sectarianism, civil war, seeing the president become not the reformer he might have been, that people thought he might be, but instead a brutal tyrant of the kind that has dominated the region for decades. Despite all of that, there's something completely inspiring about seeing people, individuals, normal everyday people, salesmen, grocers, painters, housewives, becoming heroes. And what I learned about photography in this process is that it's not good enough. It is perhaps meaningless. When was the last time a photograph changed the world? It didn't, or at least not lately. Art photography may be different because I do think art has a place in our society, challenging our thinking and reminding us of our humanity. But photojournalism, which essentially profits off other people's suffering, does not. The best photographs from Syria, the most important, the most shocking, the ones with the most potential to inspire us to action, were not taken by professional photographers. We've seen those pictures. They're slick and sickly beautiful, and they make us want to get people to get shot just so we can see the incredible look on their faces and take a picture of it. But the other pictures, the meaningful ones, are taken by Syrians themselves on their cell phones, of their family members, of their own lives. We don't need professional photographers in war zones. Syrians don't need photojournalists. They need doctors, they need people to distribute blankets, they need money, they need medicine. I'm highly skeptical of those photojournalists, especially skeptical of those photojournalists that say they go to Syria or the Congo or Libya or Afghanistan because of the horror, to bring light to these awful things. Because these foreign photographers only really know about these awful things because somebody else has already brought light to them. If they really wanted to help, they'd join Doctors Without Borders. They'd become politicians, go into public service, make the kind of decisions that mean these wars don't happen in the first place. They wouldn't wait around for the next conflict where they can rush in, make a bundle of money, a lot like arms dealers, really, and to find ways to enjoy other people's suffering. For a lot of people in this room, the conversation about photojournalism and its limitations may seem tangential or irrelevant. It's more interesting perhaps to those of you who take photographs and are considering careers one day in photography or journalism. But these images, and not just pictures, although that's where I have experience, but also video and writing, what we read about conflicts, it's important for all of us to consider critically because we're all implicated in it. By watching it, reading it, we're part of it. We're part of the demand for it. We're part of what makes sure that people get paid to take these pictures. We haven't publicly recoiled in ethical disgust. Instead, we reward these photographers, not only financially, but with public prestige. There was a picture from Iraq last year, taken by a photographer named Ayman Ogana. He's an up-and-coming young photographer, one of this new generation of hot, super dramatic, tilted horizons, oversaturated color photojournalists. And this was in the New York Times, and it shows a little girl after a car bomb in which both of her parents were killed. And she's walking towards the camera, reaching out, a look of complete devastation on her face. And I looked at that photograph for a long time when I saw it in the newspaper. I was trying to figure out what could make a person, a human being, seeing a child covered in her own parents' blood, reaching out for help in absolute desperation, take a photograph, rather than rushing to her, helping her, comforting her, bringing her to a hospital, anything at all. And how is that really very different from setting off a car bomb in the first place? This kind of photography dehumanizes the people it depicts, it dehumanizes the photographer too, and it dehumanizes us, the consumer. What are we supposed to do encountering 10 or 20 photographs like that of awful human suffering over breakfast every morning? What does it do to us as ethical human beings? There was a very famous picture years ago by a photographer named Kevin Carter of a starving little girl in the Sudan, all ribs, and she's collapsed on the ground during a famine there, and there's a vulture behind her waiting. And Kevin Carter won a lot of awards for that photograph, and he was also criticized. People said, that's a great photo, but what did you do for this little girl? And he said, I didn't do anything, I took a picture. And people were really outraged that he didn't help this girl, and that he didn't intervene in some way. But the problem is that we find these scapegoats like Kevin Carter, and by criticizing them, by pointing out why they're unethical, we're able to ignore and gloss over our own participation in these constant ethical violations. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be an ethical person, especially since the beginning of the Syrian revolution. I like to consider myself a person with principles. I do believe we should all have a say in our own lives. I believe we should be able to live without fear. But I didn't know what my role was supposed to be in Syria. Should I go join the protesters? But it's not my country. Who am I to tell Syrians how to live their lives? Or is that a lie, because we all live in an interconnected world in which everything I do affects Syrians and Indians and Mexicans, just as their lives have effect beyond their national borders? We have these great abstract discussions in schools and universities about ethics, which I think are supposed to help in situations like those when revolutions erupt and you're supposed to make choices. In these ethics classes, philosophy classes, we talk about things like, what would you do if you were stuck in a rowboat, starving to death with several other people? Would you draw straws and eat one of the other people? Would you take the chance that it's going to be you that gets eaten? What kind of a question is that? It's actually easy to argue either point of view, but the point is most of us go through our lives without ever having to make those decisions. We're not really stuck in a rowboat. We don't have to eat people. When the revolution started in Syria, I was writing a novel. I'd get up every day, sit at my desk, write, go for a walk in the afternoon maybe, eat an ice cream, hang out with friends, go for picnics. You could hear the shelling of nearby towns and shooting, and I'd wonder, what should I do? How could I sit and write fiction all day when people nearby were being slaughtered for their principles? It's not as if all this was happening 10,000 miles away. It was 10 minutes away. Eventually, after much angst and self-loathing, I decided the only ethical thing to do was to pick up a weapon and join the rebels. That's when I learned I was a coward. And in fact, I later decided that there are perhaps other ways of being in Syria ethically at this time, and that I probably shouldn't join the rebels, although sometimes I still don't know whether that's just making an excuse for myself. On the one hand, I do believe in the principles they're fighting for. I believe they should be able to vote, to choose their own leaders, to have a say in their lives. I believe they shouldn't be randomly arrested or tortured in jail. I believe they should be able to criticize their government without risk of physical harm. And how often do we get an opportunity to actually fight for those beliefs? I think a lot of us secretly harbor this fantasy that given the opportunity, we'd all be Che Guevara too. And I think a lot of us believe that we have that power within ourselves. And here was my chance. On the other hand, I don't really know how to shoot a gun, so probably I wouldn't be all that useful. I'd get shot and killed pretty fast, and that would be that. Also, by having an American with them, the rebels would be accused of promoting a Western agenda rather than what Syrians really want. And I still didn't resolve my own place in Syria, because I'm not Syrian. These aren't my rights I'm fighting for, but I am a human being. So to what extent does that matter than my national citizenship? The other thing I came to realize about ethics is that we're always in the rowboat, and we shouldn't lie to ourselves about it. The situation in Syria felt to me like this pressing ethical crisis, but we should be having these crises every day. Suffering exists in our world, and we can do something about it, and not to is unethical, even if it's easy not to, even if that suffering is pretty abstract and kind of far away and easy to ignore. We all, or at least most of our parents, probably read the New York Times every day or every week. We read these columns by Nicholas Kristof. He writes about impoverished reservations for Native Americans or sex slavery in Cambodia, sweatshops, human rights abuses, these terrible things happening in the world. And often he writes about people or organizations doing things to try to eliminate these injustices. And sometimes the more altruistic among us maybe send money. I bet everyone here has participated in fundraisers at Derryfield for some good cause, for an animal shelter, or sandy relief, or you volunteer at the local food bank once a year, a nursing home, and that's good, that's great in the short term, and I'm sure some poor African child would rather have your donated t-shirt than not. But the danger is that it allows us to feel good about ourselves, to feel like we're ethical, moral people without having to actually make real ethical choices and sacrifices, without recognizing that by even admiring Ayman Ogana's photo of that traumatized Iraqi girl, we're making sure those photographs continue to be taken. That by buying cheap t-shirts, and given two options, buying the cheaper one, we guarantee that sweatshops paying abhorrent wages continue to exist. Through the food we eat and the cars we drive and long showers we take, we make sure that we keep a large percentage of the world's population in poverty, and sickness, and violence. For me, the jarring recognition was that photojournalism does that too. It makes us, and I include myself here as an occasional and self-loathing photojournalist, it makes us feel good too, like we've done our part. It's our excuse not to be held morally responsible, not to hold ourselves to a higher moral standard. And it's inexcusable, unforgivable. We're all implicated in everything that happens in the world. It is the great promise and the great burden of our generation. We live in a globalized world. What I eat matters to the environment. What I wear matters to the Bangladeshi worker. If I want people at Walmart or in Indonesian sweatshops to earn a fair wage, I have to pay more for my iPad. If I want the oceans to last another couple generations, I should probably stop eating fish, stop buying products made by companies that pollute the ocean. It's kind of simple logic, really, but it's an ethics that demands constant awareness, constant action, and real sacrifice. It's both incredibly empowering and challenging. Our ethical work is never done. We can never be lazy about it. We can never stop being conscious of how our own actions maintain the systems of oppression that limit other people's lives. We've seen this with language a lot, right? Every time in an essay I use the word he, when really I mean he or she, I help create this socio-political system that maintains women's domination by men. So I don't, I write he or she, or if I'm really subversive, I just write she. These seem like small things, and they are, but it's the details, these careful, conscious, constant choices that will change the world. More than my running off or not running off and joining the Syrian rebels, I can make much bigger impact on the world by not eating meat, or only eating animals that were raised in humane conditions, by buying clothes that were produced in similarly humane conditions, or, this is harder, more significant, refusing to buy clothes at all, make my own, learn to sew, maybe grow my own food. And the thing is, not taking action is the same as taking action. It is an action itself. It is choosing to pollute the oceans, choosing to force third world workers to live in poverty. We live in an amazing world, different than ever before, more connected than ever before, and therefore more demanding of us. We have to learn how to live up to that challenge, which all probably deviates pretty far from those little Syrian ballerinas upstairs. But they reminded me that we all live our lives, go about our daily business, thoroughly enmeshed and shaped by the world, and we too shape that world. I don't have answers, and I strive to be more ethical and often fail, but I wanted to leave you today with a perspective to take with you when you pass through the gallery and look at the photographs, and maybe when you look at photographs in general. And that is that whomever the subject is, we are implicated in their lives. Mr. Moorline asked me to talk about my path from Derryfield to Brown to Syria and Oxford. And that's actually a pretty boring story and happened mostly by accident, just by saying yes to everything that came along. But for me, it was basically a path of dissatisfaction. It's about asking how to be an ethical person in the world and finding one unsatisfying answer after another, which led me through photography, not as an ending point, as part of the learning process. There's this idea in Islam of Sharia, which we often see translated as Islamic law, and it has to do with living the right way, according to divine will. There's this great Islamic scholar, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, who writes that Sharia is the constant search for Sharia. So it's not a set of rules about not eating pork or wearing the veil or praying 5 times a day, but about constant awareness, constant striving to live better. And I think that's a useful framework for us all, thinking about ethics for ourselves. And so I wanted to present these photographs not as a claim to any kind of truth, not as an answer, but as a question, an ethical question, about how we can all live meaningfully in this world together.